Thank you very much, Roman. It's a pleasure to be here to reflect with you on this important topic on theology and method. I'm sorry I don't speak your language. There is no translation of my paper as yet, but as far as I have understood it, there will be a translation at some point, and then you can read it, and the English text can be made available as well. I will make the opposite case as my previous speaker. I now work in Belgium, but I've worked in the Netherlands for a long time, and we have a very rich tradition in empirical theology for 30 years now, and according to my analysis, the results have been devastating for theology, exactly for the reason that the previous speaker has addressed, that theology and speaking about the social empirical reality became disconnected. But I agree with you, of course, that we need to find ways to connect the two and how to do it. So I will illustrate this point by talking to you about public theology, new developments in public theology. And again, as I said, I will make the opposite case. I will make a case when we speak about the public sphere, we need to talk about God and not forget to speak about God. I'll start with my paper. So the public sphere is quite a recent discovery of theology. It has opened a field of studies on topics such as the relationship between church and state, between religion and democracy, between religious universality and pluralism, and between divine sovereignty and human autonomy. Public theology has become the study of the publicness of religion and of the visibility of religion in a globalizing culture. It has been developed within the field of social ethics mainly, and discusses the significance of church and theology for public issues. And the concept of the public in theology, I think, serves to understand the implications of, well, at least in northwestern Europe, where I'm from, the implications of the church playing a new, more marginal role in Western society. And furthermore, reflecting theologically on the public might also serve to legitimize the study of faith in religion in a secularizing world. So there are questions of legitimation here, apologetics, perhaps of the worst kind. So does the secularity of public life confront theology with new challenges, or is the public realm the last straw for theology in a secular environment? What would theology's task be when faced with the new challenges of a globalizing world and its changing, pluralizing public sphere, and which aspect of the public sphere are suitable for or in need of theological reflection? Now, so what follows, I will work with the assumption that if theology would want to engage with public life in a secularizing society, it should offer a view of God's presence in the secular, and especially in those realms in which human beings have a constructive role to play, such as culture, care, education, labor, and politics. So in this lecture, after introducing the field of public theology, I will propose the application of the concept of sacrament to public theology that will, according to me, enable it to recognize how public life, analogous to the sacramental practice of the church, is shaped by and at best dedicated to God's hidden presence. Are there ways of viewing aspects of public life as being on its way to becoming church? Does it contain opportunities to become sign and instrument of God's kingdom? I'll start with a quote from the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus tells his disciples the parable of the hidden treasure. This is the quote. "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up again, And then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field in Matthew 13:44. So in this lecture, I will try to show that Matthew tells us here, the writer of the Gospel of Matthew tells us here that our role in the world is to discover God's reign in it, respect its hiddenness, and therefore make the world the place where God is hiddenly present, our own, in such a manner that we live towards the promised kingdom already present among us. So Jesus' message that the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand expresses both something that is supposed to be already present in the secular and an active and perhaps surprising engagement with political consequences. The treasure found, which is God's presence, is buried again, and all possessions are sold, and the whole world becomes a field in which that treasure is hidden, and where everything ultimately happens in order that the scriptures might be fulfilled. So this image from the Gospel of Matthew of the hidden, found, and reburied treasure in a field will be my guiding principle for proposing a sacramental approach to public theology in a secularizing context. The public sphere could be discovered as the realm where God becomes present. Now let me tell you something first about the developments in that new field called public theology, and I will hopefully try to show you that it seeks for a normative standpoint. Public theology is not a neutral method, it's a normative way of doing theology. So for some, public theology seems to be a rather novel mode of practicing theology, but it looks back on a relatively long history already. In 1974, the famous Lutheran theologian Martin Marty published 2 articles in which he, presumably for the first time, coined the term public theology. And in one of those articles, Marty referred to a debate on civil religion that the renowned sociologist of religion, Robert Bellah, had launched some years before. And Marty, on his part, was not happy with the generalized view that hitherto had dominated the discussion. And so he worked out a distinction between 2 different kinds of civil religion. And the first one he saw as the common denominator between disparate religious traditions, comprising artificial rites and rituals, and taking a more or less affirmative stance towards the nation and the wider society. In contrast, Marty's second kind of civil religion is based on a particular religious tradition. It comments on public affairs in a normative and prophetic manner, and it holds a critical position over against nation and society. And it was this second type of civil religion that Marty designated as public theology. Now, to indicate how successful public theology has been ever since, it may suffice to point to the fact that since the 1980s, dozens of books and hundreds of articles have been published about it. There's a global network for public theology established in 2007 and encompasses roughly about 35 centers and member institutions worldwide. And in that same year, 2007, the International Journal of Public Theology was launched. And from all this, we can conclude that public theology has proven to be a fairly successful idea in Western academic theology. And as you can tell from my introduction, I am somewhat concerned about it. So what is public theology and how can it be defined? A first definition comes from the chief editor of that journal, Sebastian Kim. In his book, Theology in the Public Sphere, he defines public theology as the outcome of Christians engaging in dialogue with those outside the church on various issues of common interest. So it involves urging Christians to take opportunities to participate in the public domain in modern secular democracies and to converse with other citizens on issues wider than religious matters. Now, although somewhat diffuse, we can learn from this definition that public theology is some sort of centrifugal activity, going beyond the spatial and doctrinal borders of one's own faith community. But the definition does not indicate the method and the purpose of this engagement. Moreover, it says nothing about the criteria the dialogue has to meet, and above all, it leaves completely open why participation in public debates is to be qualified as a theological, and not simply as a Christian or even a religious activity. So same question here as in the previous paper. What makes it theological? Now, the shortcomings of Kim's attempt are partially rectified by the following definition of Harold Breitenberg, also a famous name in the field. And in an article called What is Public Theology, he writes, "It is a theologically informed, descriptive and normative public discourse about public issues, institutions, and interactions addressed to the church or other religious bodies, as well as the larger public or publics, and argues in ways that can be evaluated and judged by publicly available warrants and criteria." So contrary to Kim, who favors public theology as a form of dialogue, Breitenberg, on the one hand, makes sufficiently clear that the Christian engagement with public issues has to be theologically informed. There you have it again. That is, it must be justified by theological reasons. And what does that mean? On the other hand, however, he also claims that the arguments being put forward should be accessible to all, as the audience is not exclusively, and perhaps not even primarily, a religious one. Furthermore, he maintains that the discourse aims at a normative purpose. There you have it again. That is, it seeks to improve public institutions and interactions. I think the previous speaker used the word transformative, and I think there's something similar going on there. Breitenberg's definition indeed raises certain questions, but he does not clarify why and how Christian participation in public debates can be based on theological reasons, and at the same time operate with reasons that are almost by definition not theological, since they are likewise addressed to a religious and non-religious public. So how can we use a common language that is understood by all and yet be theological and normative at the same time? That's a real problem. So this raises the important issue, which discourse to choose when engaging with others. And it confronts us with the problem that theology might not at all be suitable for public conversations. There's another important theologian in this field that I would like to mention, which is Max Stackhouse. And he's been one of the most prominent representatives of public theology in recent years. And he says that public theology seeks to identify those genuinely universal dimensions of divine reality and of human existence that are indispensable aspects of theology and that are often just below the surface of the present, shaping global developments. Moreover, public theology, according to Stackhouse, will seek to ethically guide and repair or even resist those developments that have proven to be deceptive, unjust, or misdirected. So there's a critical aspect here in this definition. So in his view, Stackhouse's view, theology is based on certain assumptions which likewise can be identified as effective, although usually unknown causes of a social dynamic. Public theology then has to explicate these assumptions and wherever necessary to criticize their social consequences. Now this model tries to bridge the gap between theological and non-theological statements by presupposing that both classes of arguments refer to the same social reality. His approach seems to enable a substantive theological contribution to public discourse. His point of departure, however, equals an absolute 0 point without any context. It seems as if he starts his theological enterprise on his side of the social reality and then enters into the public domain to clarify and enhance its underlying dynamic. And this is what theologians very often do. They downplay their own language and their own positions in order to be understood. So Stackhouse pays, in other words, too little attention, according to me, to the fact that the incentive to practice theology also comes from the very same social reality and does not merely rely on an internal impulse of the theologian or of the church. And this shortcoming could possibly be countered by a definition, one more, by William Storar, who writes, "I understand public theology to be a collaborative exercise in theological reflection on public issues which is prompted by disruptive social experiences that call for our thoughtful and faithful response." So it's an act of liberation and resistance. Now, this definition makes sufficiently clear, I think, that the beginning, the very beginning, so I agree with Sedmak there, of any public theological undertaking is not a neutral or unaffected point of decision, but it's the incisive experience of suffering and injustice. Now, in a secular culture, it may seem largely superfluous to invest a considerable amount of time and energy in the development and the practicing of a theology that claims to be public. Why don't we stay within the church and do our own thing there? Has the voice of theology, on the other hand, not always been audible in the public arena, and have theologians not always commented on issues of common interest? Can theology, therefore, not always be qualified as to be specifically public theology? Now, this might as well be the case, but it is also true that at approximately the same time that public theology gradually began to take shape, maybe since Reinhold Niebuhr, and then further on the 1970s and 80s, other theological projects were also launched, especially in the 80s and the 90s. In the aftermath of Alistair MacIntyre's epoch-making publication After Virtue, for example, some theologians began to mistrust public debates in general. The most famous example is John Milbank's Theology and Social Theory. Because these theologians saw hardly more in them than a clash of irrational, fragmented, and incommensurable ethical positions. Such a battle, they asserted, will never lead to a reasonable resolution of urgent political or social problems. And this very skeptical and cultural critical position fosters a suspicion that mainstream liberalism is determined to exclude all theological contributions from the public debate, and there is some truth in there. If theology is neither welcome in the political arena nor able to deliver a goal-oriented input, then there is sufficient reason to confine the theological discourse to internal matters of the faith community and not to address it to an external audience. So the sectarianism argued for here is not seldom accompanied by a very critical stance toward culture and modernity. Modernity, by Milbank, called a culture of nihilism. Now, in his book Democracy and Tradition, Geoffrey Stout disapproved of these theological trends and thereby urged religious people to commit themselves to an open, public, democratic culture, and designated the sectarian withdrawal from the secular world as a theology of resentment. According to him, the most successful representatives of this dominant theological trend can be found among the advocates of new traditionalism or radical orthodoxy, for example. So Stout's observations are exemplary for the notion that schools of resentment have dominated the theological discourse during the last decade. I think is true in Western theologies. Barthianisms are popping up everywhere again. theologies of resentment are dominating at the moment. And as this is the hope that a way is paved for a future theological engagement, according to Stout, with democracy and all kinds of other societal issues. So not surprisingly, public theologians tend to agree with Stout's findings on this point. Stackhouse, for instance, complains about neo-sectarian reassertions of particularist communal convictions, some of which claim to represent a radical orthodoxy. And I think these differences between different camps you can find in the different churches. And you're from different traditions, you can do the math. Now, until now, public theology has tried to find a way in between a so-called sectarian withdrawal from the public domain and a corresponding attitude of resentment on the one hand, and an adaptation to the wider culture and a translation of faith into a common public language on the other. Now, in my own context, in Dutch and Belgian theology, people like Stanley Hauerwas, or John Milbank, they have never been very influential. There is a lot of public theology happening also in empirical theological projects. But something is happening in my own context, so this is the context that I'm talking about. It is leaving behind Calvinist and Barthian approaches because it does not develop Christian doctrine anymore because of the rise of public theologies. And at the same time, in my own tradition, my own Roman Catholic tradition, people are renouncing the once dominant sacramental theology of Nouvelle Theologie and its conciliar and its post-conciliar successors, and replaced it for a practically oriented or empirical theology. It says so here, I didn't make it up. Now, I would like to propose that a public theology in search of a theological locus, so this is what we share, would actually profit from a retrieval, this is my proposal and this is my next step, a retrieval of the sacramental vision that characterized certain branches in Catholic theology of the 20th century, because it offers, I think, a theological view of the relationship between church and world that defies the above-mentioned sectarianism on the one hand and adaptation on the other. So by presenting to you, this is what I will do, Edward Schillebeeck's, the Flemish Dominican, Edward Schillebeeck's Sacramental Theology, I hope to show you that how the undergirding metaphysics of this theological position could or should be regarded as a starting point for contemporary public theology. So that's why I'm making another case. We should start with metaphysics, theological metaphysics, rather than the practical situation. Okay, here it comes. So for Edward Schillebeeck's, the importance of the sacraments was their worldliness. He wrote that the fact that God's presence in Jesus Christ was given to humans for their salvation is revealed in the fact that Christ has taken natural symbols from everyday life as the subject of sacramental symbolism, as he put it. Sharing bread and wine in the Eucharist becomes what Schillebeeck calls an external, eloquent, tangible expression of God's goodness and redemptive love. Thus, for him, the sacraments are not discrete instances of a miraculous divine revelatory act, but effective signs of God's ongoing presence to the world. Sacraments are calling the community of believers to witness to God's nearness and to be instrumental to the salvation that has been promised. So this witnessing community makes manifest as sign and instrument that human history itself is becoming a sacrament of salvation. According to Schillebeeck's, sacraments are signs pointing to the history of salvation of God's presence in Jesus Christ. In and by the sacraments, the living Christ remains present in his church and to the world. Now, it was from his fellow Dominicans, Marie-Dominique Chenu and Yves Congar, that Schillebeeckx had learned that God is not present to the world in and by the church alone. It is God's continuing presence to the world that is perceived, expressed, and thus reinforced by the church. And this is what the Second Vatican Council would express in its dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, with the phrase that the church is like a sacrament. The church, the council fathers formulated, is a sign and instrument both of a very closely knit union with God and of the unity of the whole human race. Now in this, the church follows Christ, who was himself the sacramental encounter with God, as Schillebeeckx had already argued in the late 1950s. So from this, it becomes clear that according to the council, I'm doing a little bit of translation here, according to the council, church and public life are not opposites, but they signify and they shape each other. And therefore, the sacramental is not confined to one or the other, and that's why it's important for public theology. Schillebeeckx's sacramental theology had a very firm Christocentric foundation throughout his work, and this, I think, should have consequences for public theology as well. To Schillebeeckx, Jesus' message and acts can be regarded as redeeming the present, the ongoing inspiration people experience as coming from his life and message, and Schillebeeckx would add, even if they do consider themselves non-believers, signifies Christ's continuing presence among us. And accordingly, church and theology do not present Christ's message to the world. So this is what public theology sometimes does. It thinks that it should present the message of the gospel to the world. But in his view, gather and seek to embody the present message of God's promise that already lives among the people. So it's a very optimistic theological position. So for Schillebeeckx, there is no radical break between Jesus' historical existence and the believer's confession that he is Christ. They are intertwined. So for public theology, this intrinsic relationship between Christ, church, and world is vital. Christ's presence in the world is primary, so also primary to our theological methods. And the church gathers the salvific truth of that event. And this constitutes, or should constitute, the church's public theology. Now, it could be argued that Schillebeeckx does not do full justice to the active work of the church as the embodiment of the newness that the risen Christ has revealed, because he located Christ's continuing presence in the world as a whole. Or one could criticize him for not fully taking our secular situation seriously by not acknowledging that in the present situation, church and world have separated in accepting and following Christ as the living one. So there are some problems here. His theological work, I think, confronts secular culture with the challenging statement that the public sphere itself out there could become a sacramental space. The church, as the community of believers, is not the exclusive body that lives on what it has received through Jesus' words and acts in history, or through God's affirmation of them. In other words, Schillebeeckx argues, faith is not the story of God handed on and practiced by the communion of God alone. Hence the maxim with which he starts his last book, Extra Mundum Nulla Salus. Now, to theologically retrieve this ongoing and renewing presence of the living Christ in the world has been at the core of Schillebeeckx's theological agenda and theological method. In 1983, in his valedictory speech, he introduced the idea of what he called a proportional identity between Jesus and the message present in our political situation. And this particular idea could serve a new model for contemporary public theology, proportional identity. So the message people embody by following Christ should relate to their situation in the same way as Jesus' message and act were related to his situation. That's the proportional identity. And this is key, I think, to Schillebeeck's theological hermeneutics. Loyalty to Christ's message, Jesus' message, he would say, is not preaching the same message, but participating and intervening in the contemporary context in the same way Jesus participated and intervened in his context. Now, this is not merely a contextual hermeneutics. The idea of proportionality introduces the current social, cultural context, either religious or secular, or both, or post-secular, into the very core of revelation itself. It is not a revelation in the past that needs us to be reinterpreted or correlated time and again in order to have some meaning for the present, but the revelatory aspect of Jesus Christ's life, death, and resurrection continually needs to be discovered within contemporary public life. That discovery, however, needs response and embodiment. I mean, it's out there, but it needs response and embodiment. The communal responsibility of the church to be sign and instrument of that which can be found in the present. Now, the church, according to Schillebeeck, is not the sole guarantee or the embodiment of the presence of God in history. The church is called to bear witness to the fact that Christ is light of the nations, as the opening paragraph of Lumen Gentium phrases it. Thus, the church is like a sacrament, but it does not own this sacramentality, but the church is made a sacrament by the faithful, enduring and ever-coming presence of the triune God. Those sacraments are not making visible to the world what should be and how it should be different, but are revealing what the world truly is and what our lives as human beings truly are, and how we therefore can and should act. Just as Jesus Christ was not divine because he was less human, but because he was truly human, a new theological, a new Catholic agenda, not simply for future reflections on the sacraments, but for a new and emerging field like public theology as well. Its ultimate goal is not to mediate the gospel of the past to a godless contemporary world, as the resentment theologians would put it, but to show how this contemporary world itself is the space for encountering the nearness of God's reign. So in the wake of Schillebeeck's theology, the task of theology is to show how public life itself is sacramental, how it can be sign and instrument of the presence of God. As Vatican II stressed it in the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, as follows: the people of God believes that it is led by the Lord Spirit who fills the earth. Motivated by this faith, it labors to decipher authentic signs of God's presence and purpose in the happenings, needs, and desires in which these people has a part along with other human beings of our age. And this, I would argue, should be the focus for a theology that wants to be truly theological and truly public. And I'll stop there.